Well, hello everybody. Welcome to today's broadcast. My name is Captain Chris Nolan from Sea Education Association in Woods Hole, Massachusetts. In today's broadcast, we're going to talk a little bit about the Robert C. Seamans voyage across the Pacific from New Zealand to the western coast of the U.S., particularly focusing on this journey from Hawaii to the west coast of the U.S. And we've got guests today, Dr. Jan Witting, Professor of Oceanography at Sea Semester, and Dr. Rich King, Professor of Maritime Studies. First thing I guess we should talk about is why is the vessel making this voyage? Well, Sea Semester vessels operate typically in New Zealand waters around this time of year. However, due to the COVID crisis and the international travel restrictions, we deemed it prudent to bring the ship back to the west coast of the U.S. So she's already completed an epic voyage from New Zealand to Hawaii and is just getting started on a voyage from Hawaii to the west coast of the U.S. The ship has 13 crew members aboard it. And just for some perspective, the ship has 40 bunks. So typically there's a professional sailing crew of about 11 and then a student crew of about 25 with some room for guests as well. So sailing with a crew of 13 is very challenging for these people, led under the able leadership of Captain Sean Burcaw. And what we hope to do with this broadcast series is introduce a little bit of the North Pacific to you, as well as follow along the Robert C. Seamans journey to the West Coast. Before we get into today's content, just wanted to introduce myself and the guests. As I said, I'm Captain Chris Nolan from Sea Semester, one of the faculty captains aboard the ships. I've had the privilege of sailing aboard Sea Semester vessels Corwith Kramer and Robert C. Seamans on many occasions. I kind of wish I was out there sailing with Captain Sean Burcaw, but the ship is in capable hands. I'd like to introduce our next two guests, Dr. Jan Witting and Dr. Rich King.
Hi, my name is Jan Witting. I'm a professor of oceanography at the Sea Education Association, and I've been sailing in the Pacific back and forth across the equator for a better part of 20 years now. If you really want to know what I'm interested in the ocean, it's primarily biology, but the interesting thing about the oceans is everything is connected. So if you want to understand where to find fish, plankton, whales, you have to understand how the place is organized, sort of physical structure, and through currents and all of that. And like you, Chris, this is an awesome voyage in something that SEA hasn't done before. And interesting little fact is, Rich and I were just on board in March when the COVID crisis began, and we had to leave the ship a little early in New Zealand.
My name is Rich King. I'm a visiting professor at SEA, specializing in maritime history and literature. And I also love being at sea, and so missing out on this voyage, but really looking forward to talking about what we might see on this passage.
One thing that you might have a question about if you're viewing this is, why is the ship particularly sailing the route it's going to be taking? And one thing we could talk about is a little bit of the weather that goes into the voyage planning that Captain Burcaw is making his decisions based on. And so right now the ship is just leaving the Hawaiian Islands. And if you go over to our Esri Story Map journal, you'll see her current location and kind of the latest entries. But the ship is leaving Oahu and basically sailing north and northeast and then over to the mainland of the U.S. Generally, Southern California is the destination. And you might think to yourself, doesn't it make more sense just to go straight there? Well, there's a particular reason why the ship is not going to be taking that route. And that is, as you might guess, weather and the fact that she is a sailing ship. So the big obstruction out here in the middle of the Eastern Pacific is a big high pressure system. And for reasons we can get into later, high pressure systems in the Northern Hemisphere tend to funnel winds just like this. Right, so it wouldn't make sense for the Robert C. Seamans to sail directly into the wind to get to Southern California. However, if you follow the winds around the high pressure system, you're going to get more favorable sailing conditions along the route. So although the mileage might be a little bit more, the effort on the crew and the efficiency of the vessel will be much greater if she takes a little bit of a detour to catch those favorable westerly winds north of the high pressure system, bringing her to Western North America. Okay, well, the Robert C. Seamans is going to be making a pretty epic voyage across a big span of water, which is always interesting to know what's going on above and beneath it. And so for more on that, I'd like to introduce Dr. Jan Witting, Professor of Oceanography. Jan?
I thought that it'd be useful to illustrate a little bit this journey by drawing the cruise track that they've already done from New Zealand to Hawaii on this Google map, Google Earth image. And this is the kind of view that we usually take on the ocean. So first of all, notice the fact that when you're looking at the globe from this perspective, it really is an ocean planet, right? But then when you're looking at it just with this kind of a view in mind, it looks just like an awful lot of blue, right? And the thing is, it's actually a very complicated place in terms of ocean productivity, in terms of temperatures, in terms of ocean circulation. So there's a lot to unpack on this journey. For example, if we look at, I've made another quick little image. This one from a satellite chlorophyll A concentration. So this is, think of it in terms of where the oceans are green, where they're very, very productive. And you notice that there are very large differences on this cruise track, things that you just don't see when you're looking at the blue marble image and not visualizing those kinds of things in the water column. And one of the really interesting things is on the second leg, and you can see that the cruise track, and this is now the anticipated cruise track. We don't really know exactly how the ship is going to navigate. The weather will dictate that, but we anticipate that it will look something like this. And you'll see that there's this a band of really bright green that shows up toward the northern arc of this projected cruise track. And that's something we call a frontal zone. This is a very, very productive area where a couple of different types of water masses meet. And the reason why they meet here has to do with what Chris just mentioned about high pressure in the atmosphere and how atmospheric circulation and how the ocean organization are really interrelated. I'm not going to try to cover all of that today, but I think if you stick around on both looking at our story map and the our subsequent YouTube chats, you'll end up learning a whole lot more about how and why the ocean is organized this way.
I think one of the best parts of Sea Semester is the journey that we take is always framed by the three main disciplines of nautical science, oceanography, and maritime studies. So for a little bit more on that, let's talk to Dr. Rich King.
Thanks, Captain Chris. Well, I'm interested sort of from an environmental history and blue humanities perspective on a pretty essential question, and this goes for any of our passages on Sea Semesters, as how has the ocean and our perception of the ocean changed over the course of human history? And I'm talking about really the last few centuries. And for this particular passage, one of the things that we're all interested in as our crew members are looking over the rail is, will we see whales? And one environmental history approach to thinking about that and predicting that, adding on to what Jan has just told us about productivity in the ocean, is where and when people saw whales in the past. And so there's a spectacular paper by Smith, Reeves, Josephson, and Lund, which was published in 2012, that compiles all the historical data that we have from the late 1700s to the early 1900s, when all these whalemen were sailing on ships very much the same size as the Robert C. Seamans all around the Pacific. And they compiled data which had been collected since the 1840s by Matthew Fontaine Maury, and not only collected it by species, but also by month. And so you can see right here, this is collected for the month of June. And when we look up at this figure right here, you can see that actually the whalemen did not see a lot of whales at this time on our projected passage from Hawaii to California. That big purple blob is showing that's the Hawaiian Islands and all the expeditions that went in and out of there. So Hawaii was a huge whaling center, but the whalemen in the 19th century in particular were not spending a lot of time around this body of water, mostly because they didn't find a lot of whales there, or perhaps for selection bias, they didn't think that they were going to find whales, or that the trade winds were poor here and they didn't want to get caught without wind in this area. And so this is a really wonderful figure to look at as we try to say, hey, will we see whales? We can go back and look historically to see where they saw whales, when, and then we can match that to what we know about whale migration and populations today. The second aspect that I'm really interested in is what fish and birds and invertebrates our crew will observe from the ship's rail. And so for me, that's just what makes every expedition so exciting, is you just never know what's going to happen every day. Sometimes I can barely go down for lunch because I want to be up on deck to see what's going to happen and see what we're going to see. And so a vessel like the Robert C. Seamans, often under sail, can really enjoy that sort of close to the water quiet that is rare today on any type of vessel. And so I'm interested in what the crew observed, and so during this passage, we'll be keeping close track of what the crew reports and taking photographs and video and keeping the location on anything they observe. But I'm also interested in sort of how they respond to various things, to a shark fin, to a squid floating in the water, to Velella floating in schools. And so I want to know how they're responding to that, and then put that in a chronological, almost a perception map, a chronological history of how we observe and think about marine organisms. And for me, recently, I've been really interested in those early solo voyagers who have gone around the Pacific by themselves in these small, quiet vessels, and the things that they've observed and how they've responded to it. And so two particular narratives I'm really interested in now is one by Harry Pigeon. He was the second person to sail solo around the world, but he went around the world twice, and he went back and forth from Hawaii to LA. And so he has some really interesting accounts of the productivity of the waters in these areas. And then also Sarah Seitz Adams, who was the first woman who sailed across the Pacific from Yokohama down to San Diego. And she also spent a lot of time describing marine organisms, but she was in the 1960s at a time where we were really thinking about the marine environmental movement in the United States. And so those are some of the things that I'm thinking about, and I'm really going to be watching closely the crew's blog posts about the things that they see looking over the rail.
You know, Rich, this is why it's so gratifying to be working with people like you when we're, at SCA and on our ships. So Sean Burkock, the captain now on board the ship, as a wee lad, as a child, was on board their family boats. They were on a circumnavigation, and Sean sent a very nice set of observations, just musings, as the ship, as Robert C. Seamans was crossing the French Polynesian waters, and just remarking how his childhood memories showed a lot more life in the ocean.
Mm-hmm.
And he was a little sad about not seeing as much as he thought he would. And you, with your historian skills and eyes, are taking people's observations, and enough of them, and weaving a map of it that informs us better than just one person's anecdotal evidence. So this will be very interesting to hear your perspectives as the ship goes on.
Thanks, Jan. Yeah, no, Sean is a really amazing person to be the captain on this particular voyage and all the things that he shared. Yeah, I'm just starting this project with, in terms of looking at small sailors and navigators, but I think there's a lot there. Even if it's mostly anecdotal, when you start to build all these stories, you start to get an interesting picture, best we can, in terms of what these historical seas look like.
It's a big ocean, and there are more stories than the three of us here now can bring up. So we hope to have a lot of other people and colleagues help bring these things alive. The ship is not going to be stopping for science in a way that we usually do, simply because they don't have the crew of the students who are such an integral part of everything that we do. But they do have some instruments that are recording various things in the water column. There's a little bit of data from the ship included in a little call out on that chlorophyll A map, and just sea surface temperature as the ship moves along. And there are these big gaps in it where there is no data, and it's not because anything broke or people got lazy and just didn't supervise the instruments. Nope. We came to the jurisdictional area, the economic exclusive zone of French Polynesia. And since we had not secured in advance a research permit, research clearance, we had to turn off all of the scientific observation capacity on the ship and just go as a ship of doing an innocent passage. And those are sort of interesting political aspects that traveling on the world's oceans bring up, and I hope that we get to tackle as many of those kinds of things in these subsequent little YouTube chats.
Well, that's a pretty cool discussion about the ship's voyage from Hawaii to the west coast of the U.S. Looking forward to having you with us along this journey. For more, check out the Esri Story Map Journal. We've got links below. And the ship is going to be going through some pretty awesome oceanographic areas, including the Great Pacific Garbage Patch. So we'll have a chance to take a look and talk more about that as we get through it, and also follow along with some of the personal stories of the crew as they make this epic voyage. Thanks for watching.